very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with the weekly installment of GeoEngineering Watch Radio and Global Alert News for April 23rd, 2016. The show is broadcast on KQMS Saturday mornings, 6 a.m. throughout Northern California for the internet and listeners that don't realize that. It's also posted after the show for anyone to catch the update there. It's a commercial-free hour. Again, we pay for it out of pocket so that we're not muddying the message with some commercial for who knows what. And we want to get as much news out as we can in that hour. A couple of quick announcements. We'll get on to more important data. Earth Day today at the Reading City Hall. I hope many people can come there. We'll have a booth there, geoengineeringwatch.org and Global Alert News Radio. We'll have a booth there with free materials on climate engineering, exactly what's going on in the skies above our heads and what you can do to bring it to light and to a halt, and just how great a threat this is, an unimaginable threat. The consequences are already far beyond cataclysmic, so come by Earth Day, get some free materials and find out what's going on, because it is affecting you and your life in ways that you can't even imagine yet if you don't know about this issue. Also, at the Reading Library on April 30th from 2 o'clock to, I think, 4 o'clock, we'll have a representative from Orchard Nutrition in the conference room there that will go over how you can stay healthy in a planet that's anything but. So I hope people can put that in the calendar as well, because all of us are getting sicker. We're swimming in a toxic sea of contamination, starting with what's occurring above our head. Short update on our web helper, Doug Diamond, and a very dear friend who I announced last week was in a very bad accident. Doug is recovering faster than expected. Great news. He's an exceptional human being. It's an honor to call him my friend. I'm very, very pleased that he's getting better quickly. Also, congressional candidate Jeffrey Gerlach at jeffreygerlachforcongress.org, the only candidate that is willing to address the climate engineering insanity. Jeffrey's a very, very intelligent, articulate human being. He's got a lot to offer in a system that is stacked with people who are only bought, sold, and paid for actors in a play of total deception. That's what we have right now. Jeffrey Gerlach, after meetings with him that I've had several, believe that he is a real step forward. And although the whole political system is completely beyond repair, there's no question about that. People need to realize that. It's beyond repair. But having a congressional candidate that would at least help to bring certain issues to light is only a step forward, needs to be seen as such. But again, for those who are buying into the political system as a whole as being a potential way to fix anything, the cancer is malignant. There's no fixing it. The public has to stand up and face issues on their own, or we're not going to get anywhere. Here's a quote from Mark Twain to start our day. Twain was one of my favorite authors, in addition to Stoic philosophy and a lot of other sources of literature, but who could argue Twain's wisdom? Here's a quote from Mr. Twain. Why was the human race created? Or at least, why wasn't something credible created in place of it? God had his opportunity. He could have made a reputation, but no. He must commit this grotesque folly, which must have cost him a regret or two when he came to think it over and observe its effects. How true is that right now? The effect of the human race on the planet. Astounding. Even more astounding is how many people want to deny this. How many people are clinging to delusions that make them feel safer. And delusion doesn't make you safe, by the way. Delusion only increases the peril that we face. Another quote from Mr. Twain, and I'll get on to more pressing news. As to the human race, it is perhaps the poorest of all inventions of the gods, but it, the human race, has never suspected it once. There's nothing prettier than its naive and complacent appreciation of itself. It comes out frankly and proclaims, without bashfulness or any sign of blush, that it is the noblest work of God, that it has a billion opportunities to know better than that. But all signs fail with this species. I could say harsh things about it, but I cannot bring myself to do it. It is like hitting a child. This is from Mr. Twain, someone who is revered in the literary world, who saw things for what they were. He absolutely saw things for what they were. And it was not a pretty sight, and much less so now. And a quote that I've repeated several times in the past, but it's always on my mind, a quote from Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau, who said this: "Thank God men cannot fly, lest they would lay waste to the sky as they have done to the earth." We're there. We're there. Very insightful individuals, Twain and Thoreau. We should consider what they have left us and look at these nuggets of wisdom as opposed to what so many spend their time on, the meaningless, materialistic pursuits. Pressing on, the circus of insanity continues. We have Disneyland commercials on our programming TV box, followed by asthma and allergy commercials, and the grand finale, often military recruiting commercials, a true circus of insanity. This militarization and destruction of the planet at a time like this, when the human race most needs to pull together if we are to have any chance of surviving. There's been no shortage of headlines this week, and the insanity continues, as I've stated. In fact, there's an avalanche of critical stories, and that will only increase. We'll get to as many headlines as we can in a few minutes. And I want to stress again, does anyone look up? I mean, this is truly astounding, and this is the greatest threat we face. It's going on every single day. It's not like it's an event that's come and gone, and now it's in the rearview mirror. It's there every single day. Does anyone stop to remember what a blue sky looked like? A truly blue sky. It's gone almost always, and no one even remembers. Now, how bad do the ongoing atrocities have to get in our skies before the population as a whole faces the fact that they're the subject of a grand and unimaginably destructive, highly toxic experiment without their knowledge or their consent? An ongoing climate engineering assault that's wreaking havoc on the environment and the human health of every individual on the planet. If you care about your children, if you care about anything, do some real research and find out what's going on around you before there's nothing left to salvage. Again, today, Earth Day. Come to Earth Day. Get some materials and find out what's going on. If you think you can avoid this problem, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. You're completely unaware of the damage that's already been inflicted on you and your children and everything you care about. In many cases, irreparable damage. Come get a free DVD and take the time to watch it and find out what you don't know. And let's get to some weather that relates to this. This is news. This is big news, in fact. How desperate are the climate engineers becoming? Very desperate. The completely engineered winter storm Vexo. Think of these theatrical names. I go over this every week, and it sounds like a repeat. It's not. Every week we have an engineered storm, and we had this the tail end of last week and then into part of this week. A stunning example of engineered weather. So we had record warm temperatures all around this bullseye of chemically ice-nucleated snow and a chemically ice-nucleated cool down. The snow was falling again. 45 degrees in Colorado, kept on for many days while we were having record-shattering temperatures completely surrounding this bullseye of moisture being pumped in from the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, a winter storm with moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. And in Denver, that was about 80 degrees before the storm set in. It's going to be 80 degrees, I believe, today, or it was yesterday. So how does this happen? And at what point do people wake up to the fact that the whole climate system is being completely derailed? And at what time do we hold accountable those in media and agencies who are simply lying to us, elected officials who are lying to us because they're looking out for their own interests. They think they are, anyway. They believe they're looking out for their own interests by protecting their paychecks and pensions and helping to sink the entire ship. But it's up to us, the public, to hold them accountable. And when people wonder again, when they wonder, how did it get so bad? How could it be so bad? How could the cancer be so vast? If you wonder that, most of society needs to take a good long look in the mirror. It got that bad because we've spent our time entertaining ourselves, pursuing material wealth and personal pleasures, while this cancer expanded. Eisenhower warned us. What did we do? Too many material goods to keep us distracted, now more so than ever. I saw a survey of college students to see, they were testing to see if they would notice major things happening around them while they were walking on their iPhones. It was astounding. There was jugglers and all sorts of major staged events going on while people walked right by that event and they never even looked. Never even looked. And they certainly aren't looking up, are they? Or they would see the atrocities that are happening again in the skies. And how is it that meteorologists like our local KRCR, Mike Kruger, know ahead of time? This is a valid question, isn't it? I want everybody to ask themselves this question. And not just picking on Mike Kruger or our local meteorologists, all meteorologists. How is it they know ahead of time that skies will be, for example, mostly cloudy or mostly sunny? Days ahead of time they know this, and on those days there's only the blocked out, hazy, dingy, dirty sky from the spreading aircraft trails. Now, how could they know that unless they're reading a script? And they are reading a script, by the way. We know this. We have the data to prove it. Raytheon does all the weather modeling for the National Weather Service and NOAA. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So you have one of the primary geoengineering players supplying all the weather modeling to National Weather Service, NOAA, and everyone else down the line, like our local Mike Kruger. He's reading from a script. So again, just ask yourself, I don't want anybody to believe anything I'm saying, ask yourself that simple question. How can they know days ahead of time it's going to be, for example, mostly sunny, and there's not a real cloud in the sky? If you recognize real clouds and aerosol clouds still, I hope you do. If people look up and start to jog their memory, they'll remember that we used to have white clouds in a blue sky. And now, all too often, we have this dirty, toxic, industrial-looking, milking white, hazy, cobwebby-looking, scattered, spreading out aircraft trails that are not condensation. Condensation doesn't hang in the air like that. Sorry. If you believe that, you've believed and bought into the greatest lie ever perpetrated on the human race. Again, have you ever seen anyone in Antarctica, researchers, anyone anywhere, that in temperatures that are every bit as cold as what these aircraft are in at altitude, breathing out air that's of course laden with humidity because it's coming out of the human body? Have you seen researchers in these very cold places with clouds hanging around them because their condensation just stays in the air? Of course not. Of course not. Do some research. Again, the rain that's moved over California is constantly siphoned off. Massive white canopies. Even when you see the natural cumulus clouds starting to blow in, above that you see a white canopy all too often. No beams of sun coming through it because there's a canopy of geoengineered aerosols above it. And that is the purpose of solar radiation management, to block the sun. Let's get on to other news stories. The Texas flooding, again, that was part of the moisture being pumped up toward the engineered storm, the engineered low pressure, surrounded by record high temperatures where they need a lot of water for the ice nucleation, and a lot of people get damaged along the way. That's what's happening in Texas. Also, Ecuador. How many people knew there was a massive flood in Ecuador? Some 4 million people out of their home right now. Massive flooding. Nobody talks about it here because we're watching the political theater, the absolute unbelievable stupidity with a cast of characters, none of which is qualified to hold an office if it was a legitimate office, which it's not. But Again, how long will we buy into this facade? How long? Now, there's a recent article, here's a headline, that documents exactly what's happened to science. I'll get to some other news breaking headlines in a moment, but this is important. A recent and very on target article headline called Scientific Regress by William Wilson. And here's a summary paragraph from that article. Quote, "At its best, science is a human enterprise with a superhuman aim, the discovery of regularities in the order of nature, and the discerning of the consequences of those regularities. We've seen example after example of how the human element of this enterprise harms and damages its progress through incompetence, fraud, selfishness, prejudice, and the simple combination of an honest oversight or slip without plain bad luck." And I think we have to put the emphasis here on the incompetence, fraud, and selfishness and prejudice. Science is, in so many cases, unfortunately now, simply a method of deception. That's how bad it is. I'll get to some examples in a moment. These failings need not hobble the scientific enterprise broadly, continuing from this report, but only if scientists are hyper-aware of and endlessly vigilant about the errors of their colleagues and of themselves. When cultural trends attempt to render science a sort of religion, scientists are apt to forget that they are made of the same crooked timber as the rest of humanity and will necessarily imperil the work that they do. The greatest friends of the cult of science are the worst enemies of science's actual practice. Science in the academic community is being used as a weapon of mass deception for the population. And let me give an example that I've given before, but it's about the most stunning example we could get. Building 7, third building, World Trade Center of the 9/11 disaster. If you've never seen this building come down, I challenge you, go to the internet, look it up. Building 7 collapse. Watch that building collapse. And then consider the official story. It collapsed in 7 seconds, free fall speed. 47-story steel structure, high-rise building. Never got hit by anything. Collapsed in 7 seconds. And the official story from the largest governmental science institution of all, NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, the official story is that that building collapsed because some furniture was burning on the first floor. Now, back to how hijacked the science community is. How much worse could it be than that? The largest governmental science community of all telling us a steel structure high-rise, and by the way, no steel structure high-rise before that day had ever collapsed under any circumstances, even with fires burning for 48 hours in some cases, down to a steel frame, because they can't collapse from a carbon fire. It's impossible. In fact, it's so far from being possible, it's ludicrous to even believe that this could happen under any circumstances again. So, if you watch Building 7 collapse and you buy the official story, I'm not sure what else I can say to you, because you're not thinking for yourself anymore. And when you look up in the sky and you don't connect the dots, how could it be relatively blue one day, not true blue because the sky's hazy at best, and then grid patterns the next day? Or how could you see an aircraft leaving a trail from horizon to horizon, another one next to it, if you look closely, leaving nothing? Why would we have a grid pattern in the daytime and you come out at night when the atmosphere is cooler and there's more humidity and you can see the aircraft going by? In most cases, there are exceptions, but in most cases, and they're leaving nothing again at night. Because with solar radiation management, they try to allow some of the radiant heat to escape at night. We have a society that's been trained to blindly accept what the quote-unquote experts tell them. And this goes to the medical and pharmaceutical industry too. We've talked about that a lot in the past. How many would take the pharmaceutical they see on TV? When I just saw one today that was for eczema or a skin condition. And if you take this, part of the consequences were heart failure, cancer, and death. Now, how soon till the lawyer commercial comes out about that one? if you've taken this and are now with cancer or dead. Speaking of deaths, we added another one 2 days ago. Prince died. People have seen that. Merle Haggard died recently. Both of these very well-known individuals spoke out publicly on the geoengineering issue. Many might not know that. And so some are speculating that perhaps they were targets. Now, I don't claim to know, and certainly I've seen no data to corroborate that. But I will say this. When both die of respiratory issues, and we're all getting worse from respiratory issues, people ask me, of course, do I think there's a connection? And I can say this conclusively. To some degree, anyone who dies of a respiratory issue, there can't not be a connection. There must be some connection. Whatever part of the equation it is, it's certainly a part of it. When we have the lab test to prove that there's a mountain of toxic metals raining down on us, we're all inhaling it, we're all breathing it, it's highly inflammatory, causing respiratory distress, thus we have all the asthma and allergies, autism, so forth. It can't not be a part of the equation. So anyway, we lost one more celebrity who was openly speaking out about the aerosol spraying issue. That's unfortunate. Saudi Arabia 9/11 report. Some mainstream media coverage of this, the 28 redacted pages that related to Saudi Arabia. Now, whatever the final conclusions of this, shouldn't that be a massive red flag for anybody, for everybody, now that the U.S. is having increasing friction with Saudi Arabia, our very defended ally who, again, lops off heads of political dissenters and hangs them headless from cranes. And this is our ally for Obama, for Bush, for Clinton, and all the rest going back. Why? Obviously why? Because of the oil they have. The oil's not that important now, is it, since there's so much of a glut. The friction is building between the governments, and now we have some finger pointing at Saudi Arabia because so many of the hijackers are from Saudi Arabia. And let's all remember that the only plane allowed to fly after 9/11 was a plane filled with Saudi nationals, no interrogations, no interviews, flown home, no questions asked. At what point do the lights go on for all of us? That 9/11 was anything but what we were told, obviously. Now, and let's carry it further again, as we've stated before, whatever's on these 28 pages that's now in the news, and that I hope we hear more about this, and whatever implications there are for Saudi Arabia, can't tell me that our military, the most capable and competent in the world, could not have dealt with that situation if they were allowed to. And how many people know that Dick Cheney took over for NORAD that day? How many people know that there were drills going on that day with our military men and women, and they didn't know what was real and what was not? That was the point. That was the purpose. In order for Darth Cheney to orchestrate things in a more effective manner. And again, I'm not saying Obama's any better at all. Obama's prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. So some items are starting to get to the surface. Let's hope that continues. Let's dive further into headlines. Here's some recent headlines about the die-off of the world's oceans. Again, for those of you who listen to the show perhaps week to week, you may remember on previous shows that we've had some mention of others on other radio shows on the same station which I'm broadcasting on here who were completely ridiculing any notion that there was anything wrong in the oceans. Nothing wrong, relating it to Bigfoot, swamp monsters, space aliens, and what they're programmed to say, because frankly reality obviously scares them very much, so they don't want to face these realities that are unfolding. But these realities are real and verifiable. I don't want anybody to believe me. I'm asking you to look it up so you understand that your world is imploding around you. So here's another headline. 10,000 tons of dead sardines wash ashore. This is from NBC, by the way. Many networks covered this. Residents of Chile are calling for government action after dead sardines are washed up. Any comprehension of how much 10,000 tons of dead sardines are? It's unimaginable. Now, as I've stated in previous shows, this is in the southern hemisphere. Northern hemisphere, specifically, on the west coast of North America, the fishing industry is already crashing. It's already shut down because the vast majority of the fish are already dead. When we're talking about the forager fish, which sardines are, the bottom of the food chain, because the plankton's dying. Let's go further down the food chain. Global plankton population's down 50 to 60%. Plankton produces 50 to 60% of Earth's oxygen supply. Earth's oxygen content is plummeting because the trees are also dying as well. We've already lost 55% of Earth's trees. So, again, for those that think that this paradigm is going to keep going along, think again. We're about to hit the wall. If you don't believe me, you will. So 10,000 tons of dead sardines. If you don't believe me, look that up. Another headline, thousands of dead swordfish cover Lopes Mendes Beach, Brazil. From that report, states 5 days ago, the Lopes Mendes Beach is considered the second most beautiful beach in Brazil. And the 2016, April 11th is when this actually occurred. It was covered by thousands of dead swordfish. We're way up the food chain now. Swordfish is at the top of the food chain in the ocean. So we are seeing the entire ecosystem collapse. You won't be eating fish much longer, and you shouldn't be eating it now because it's all toxic, either from the radiation in the Pacific or the oil spill, and the oil spill dispersant corrects it. It's scattered everywhere there, so you shouldn't be eating fish anyway, but you're not going to have the option much longer, no matter what. Now, more headlines, non-environmental headlines. Mobs of angry investors fight market rigging. Deutsche Bank in class action lawsuit. Other banks next. The whole system is corrupt. The whole entire system. Government, finance, everything. A giant cancer. Why? Because of the types of traits Mr. Twain mentioned in the quotes that I just went over. A giant cancer. Another headline. The bad smell hovering over the global economy. From that report states, attempts at economic stimulus have left a bad smell. Central banks are starting to think the unthinkable, helicopter money. For those that don't know what that means, and there's a lot of people that don't. They don't know what the central banks are. They don't know what the Federal Reserve is. It's just private bankers who run the world. They run the militaries. They're responsible for the spraying in our skies. They are the core. And what's their last desperate move? And they're already doing it. It's not like it's coming. They're doing it. They're flooding the system with money. Why would the stock market go back up? Why would it go back up when we have the biosphere collapsing? Steel industry screeching to a halt. Oil industry screeching to a halt. And what evidence do we have that that's happening? Here's another headline that will give us some evidence. Saudi Arabia takes out $10 billion in bank loans. Saudi Arabia, the country with all the oil, and which was all the money as well at one point. No longer. Everything's changing at light speed. So, again, if you've bought the lie that this is just some bump in the road that we're encountering right now, think again. Another headline. Big U.S. banks grapple with costs as they face an ominous 2016. The card house is coming down. It's that simple. Another headline. The S&P 500 is overvalued by 72%. And that's really still an optimistic outlook. It's nothing more than a grand facade propped up by printed, fed, fiat money. Period. That's how the system works. Now, another headline, which plugs into all of this, quote, why the media lies so much. Well, that's what they're paid to do. It's exactly what they're paid to do. And that's exactly what much of academia is paid to do. Thus, let's backtrack to what I read about the science community and how hijacked science has become because of the fraud and the corruption. They're no different than the banking industry, no different at all. And when I talk about the climate, and I'm going to in a moment, to bring some headlines in that department. Aside from what I say or anyone else says or what you look up online from sources, think for yourself. How can we have the kind of weather whiplash we're having from 80 degrees to snow and back up to 80 degrees? And when you touch your car now, even with the ambient temperature being not so warm, how hot is the surface of that car? And look at the tree bark. Look around town. Look at the south-facing sides of the trees. In so many cases, the bark is completely cooked off the tree. And the radiant sun feels very hot. Because it is. Because climate engineering is destroying the protective layers of the atmosphere. And for all those who, again, buy into the fact that the proverbial they wouldn't do this to themselves, I've given week after week, example after example of what they, the central bankers who control everything, do to themselves. Why? Because they're not sane. They're not sane, and you can never cure their lust for power. It can't be cured. It makes them psychopathic. This is a literal clinical condition. So, again, between nuclear power plants, nuclear weapons, depleted uranium ammunition, the detonation of nuclear bombs, I've gone over this again and again. So if you talk yourself out of looking at the truth and convince yourself there's nothing going on because they wouldn't do this to themselves, you're not looking at reality. Now, so we know media lies because they're paid to lie. We know our academicians are lying. Our meteorologists are lying. Start thinking for yourself. Another headline. This is job cuts. Again, while the market's going up because it's being artificially pumped up, here's some headlines. Intel Corporation to cut 12,000 jobs globally. That's a lot of jobs for one company, isn't it? And these are just a few headlines. Workforce as PC sales plummet. Nordstrom to cut 350 to 400 jobs. Even stores like the high-end retail cutting jobs. Companies across the board are cutting jobs. So how can the market be going up? How can that happen? Again, it's artificially inflated. Another one, Qantas cuts back flights in face of falling demand and confidence. Airline industry, they're being subsidized as well. Why? Because their aircraft are being used in the aerosol spraying operations. I'm not guessing. If you don't believe me, go to geoengineeringwatch.org, look at the high bypass turbofan jet engine tutorial, and you will see photographs of nozzles mounted on commercial aircraft on the pylon directly above the engine exhaust stream to make it appear as if we are seeing condensation. Take a look for yourself. Take a look at the film footage we have of these tankers turning on and off with the nozzles visible. So the airline industry is being subsidized. Another headline. 200 million barrels of oil sit idle in tankers waiting to unload at Chinese ports. From that headline, we have this in the report. Middle East ports are choking on the oil waiting to be loaded onto tankers and shipped to Asia. And Asian ports are forcing tankers to wait for weeks before unloading because their infrastructure can't cope with these amounts of oil. Asia's stocking up on oil while it's cheap. And again, our whole paradigm is shifting in ways that people don't know or understand. I'll get to that later in the broadcast, because when it comes right down to it, what do most Americans care about? They don't really care about the environment, what's happening above their heads, or how corrupt the political system is or the banking system. They just want cheap gas and cheaper goods and cars for nothing down and no payments and no interest. If we don't break that mindset and start showing some responsibility toward the whole, toward the greater good, there'll be nothing left to salvage. A couple more headlines and we'll get on to some more detailed news. Canada's oil industry to see 62% decline in investment. Wow, that's a huge drop, isn't it? The tar sands, thankfully, are being economically shut down at this point. And by the way, for those that think the tar sands is a great energy source, the tar sands are an energy net negative at a massive cost to the environment. It takes about 1.45 units of energy to get 1 unit of energy from the tar sands. There's an excess of natural gas there, and that natural gas is used to process the tar sands at a massive net loss. Why would you do it? It's about profit. They have too much of one, not enough of the other. And no matter what destruction they do to the environment, the conversion of natural gas to petroleum, hydrocarbon, crude is unimaginably destructive. But this is the mentality of the human race. Short-term gain, total loss, long-term. Last two headlines. North Dakota rig count, oil rig count, at historic low. This is from the crash in the fracking industry. Not a moment too soon, by the way. Last headline. Earth's hot streak continues for a record 11 months. I'll get to more details on that soon. But this is 11 successive months hotter than the last. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about which season, because we're talking about global. So if it's winter somewhere, it's summer somewhere else, of course. So we're talking about global temperature records. So the month is irrelevant. The fact is we've had 11 consecutive months of each month breaking the prior month, and not just for a given season or a temporary time frame. This is since record keeping began. This is a very significant record. I'll get to more details on that soon. Now, I want to get to earthquakes. This week saw some major earthquakes, which the U.S. mainstream media, by the way, almost completely omitted coverage of in lieu of their constant coverage of the ongoing political theater of the absurd. And this is astounding, isn't it? We had hundreds of people dead in some of these locations, and how can they omit that? They find time to cover the most ridiculous dramas from somewhere in the country from time to time, the Nancy Grace type stories, right? Some theater of domestic dispute and all sorts of other absurdities, but they couldn't cover massive earthquakes. That's our media. Now, the mechanism of mass distraction, which is the media, which includes institutions like the Weather Channel, paid disinformation site that's always doing their best to cover the tracks of the climate engineers by having their paid liars who masquerade as meteorologists explain away the completely engineered weather catastrophes as anomalies and as if they're natural. And also a reminder of who is the Weather Channel's primary commercial sponsor. Who would you think? The U.S. military. So are we really to think that the Weather Channel would tell us the truth about climate engineering when their main sponsor is the core of management of climate engineering, the U.S. military? Of course not. And watch these Weather Channel actors, as I've stated in the past, watch them try to explain away some of what's happening right now. It's becoming increasingly obvious that they're increasingly uncomfortable with what they're having to say and do to hide what's happening. And here's a quote from the Weather Channel's primary sponsor, the U.S. military, which is very telling as to the state of our society. Here's the quote from a military recruiting commercial played on Weather Channel constantly. "In a complex world, we have one mission, to win." Now, how simplistic is that? One of the other commercials said, "The U.S. Navy, a global force for good. We're good, they're bad." And this quote I just read also, one mission, to win. To win at what cost? What exactly does that mean? And a win for who? Who are the losers? And what about the damage that the U.S. military is doing to the planet? With nuclear detonations, the use of depleted uranium ammunition, the massive consumption of every imaginable resource, including the destruction of the biosphere, again, by climate engineering. And as I mentioned in previous shows, I spoke to the Navy's PR person who very cavalierly told me the Navy was using depleted uranium, highly radioactive ammunition for practice off the North American West Coast. I wonder why everything's dying. People blame everything on Fukushima. It's not just Fukushima. Not at all. Fukushima is a huge part of the problem, but only a part. How much more direct is using radioactive ammunition right off our coast? That's what's happening. Now, the majority of the human race continues to appear completely committed to the planetary omnicide. For those that don't know what omnicide means, it means the destruction of the entire web of life, not just ecocide or genocide, but omnicide. Now, the destruction to the planet being inflicted by the industrialized and militarized civilization, with climate engineering at the top of that list, by the way, top of the list of destruction, most destructive force on the planet today, mathematically. But have these activities already sealed our fate? If we don't wake up and pull together to turn the tide, our final destination is becoming very clear. It's right in front of us. If we don't turn directions very, very quickly, we're going to hit the wall at full velocity. Now, in regard to earthquakes, there are studies now underway to detect and evaluate the ELF frequencies, extra low frequency signals that are detected over epicenters in the days prior to earthquakes. As I've stated in previous shows, MIT detected this in the days prior to the Japanese quake that caused Fukushima, and there was extremely anomalous heating in the atmosphere prior to that quake. So again, we have study now to try to evaluate these signals that are appearing over the epicenters. And here's the critical question. Does the buildup of the pending quake produce this specific low-frequency signal that is being detected, or are low-frequency signals, like those produced by ionosphere heater installations like HARP, being focused on a seismically sensitive zone, possibly helping to trigger the quake? And for those, again, that don't believe man could ever trigger a seismic event, do some real research. Fracking has verifiably produced thousands of incidents of seismic activity. And the data is clear in regard to the effect of transmitting these powerful low-frequency signals into seismically sensitive zones. It does cause seismic activity. Do your research. Now, here's from the report, and here's the title of the report. Very low-frequency electromagnetic signals associated with earthquakes. It's a title from a science report that's new. From the conclusion section of that report, a technique has been developed to detect VLF, very low-frequency signals, associated with earthquakes. The basic elements of our method include selection of pulse-like VLF, very low-frequency signals, temporal correlation with earthquakes, and selection of signals on coincidence of the direction of the signal arrival with that of the epicenter. We have presented 4 examples of observations that, in our opinion, demonstrate a feasibility of VLF emissions coming from the epicenter. Now, again, does this fit? Is the horse before the cart here? When we know we have a network of ionosphere heaters, when we know we have a military-industrial complex that's completely out of control, when we know we have strange atmospheric heating also occurring above these epicenters, why would we not at least consider that these may be weapons of unimaginable destruction? Unimaginable. And we have a lot of interesting geopolitical circumstances surrounding some of the timing of these quakes, like Japan. Japan was starting to ally with its regional partners prior to the quake. After the quake, they were absolutely towing the line for the U.S. and Western power structure. So we've had, in the last week, we've had about 5 strong earthquakes that have jolted Asia, 16 major earthquakes measuring 6.0 or higher in April. Now, as the Earth heats, you have thermal expansion as well, adding to the potential for seismic activity. We have glacial rebound, again, as the weight of the ice decreases on Greenland, Antarctica. You have those factors as well. In regard to what may be happening with these ionosphere heaters and their effect, it's impossible to know what is doing what. But when we have, for example, a 7.0 earthquake that killed a great many people in Ecuador, why isn't our media covering that? Even for a short time, there was a few excerpts on it, but not much. They're covering the political theater, and they're ignoring everything else. They're ignoring headlines of the climate meltdown. They're ignoring headlines of 10,000 tons of fish washing up in Chile, thousands of swordfish on the beaches of Brazil. They're ignoring everything. And the American people as a whole are all too happy to have such news ignored because they don't want to think about it. But as I've stated in the past, we listen to internationally renowned psychoanalysts like Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled. The hallmark of a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face the truth no matter how dire. Period. Now, in regard to media and why our media is not doing anything effective, I want to give one example of someone whose radio show I've done and who I think has truly dedicated himself to the common good. I know we're taking a little bit of a divergence here, but this is important because we're talking about media not reporting any of these events and reporting only what the power structure wants them to report, right? So we need real journalists, certainly, and that can't be argued. Well, one real journalist, Pete Santilli, is locked up because he dared to cover the events that happened in Burns, Oregon. I understand he was locked up for some time in solitary confinement. So again, as the Western power structure is increasingly pushed into a corner from every direction, it makes those who really run the U.S. government increasingly dangerous. And as they're laying the groundwork for global conflict, the mainstream media propaganda and the shutdown of any real journalism is going to continue to worsen radically. So back to Pete Santilli, radio announcer Pete Santilli. Now here's some facts I got from someone who's very close to Pete. I want to read these one by one. So Pete was locked up and indicted and arrested on January 26th. Pete, again, independent journalist that covered the events in Burns, Oregon. Locked up and arrested on January 26th and later indicted for what the government is calling his role in the Bundy Ranch standoff. Santilli and others are being charged for 2 incidents in 2 different states, Oregon and Nevada, simultaneously, because Santilli also covered the events on the Bundy Ranch in Nevada. This places them and their attorneys at a very unfair disadvantage. Another fact, Pete Santilli was present at both the Bundy Ranch standoff and the Burns, Oregon County protest. This is a very profound question. Why weren't other journalists, including many from mainstream media, arrested for being there? Why not? Some even went inside the refuge buildings and one spent the night within. Now, Santilli didn't do that. He didn't go inside. More facts from journalist Pete Santilli. He was armed with a camera, didn't carry any weapon at any time on his person. He called for a peaceful, legal, constitutional resolution. He never physically threatened any law enforcement officers. Final factoid. Santilli was very mindful about, quote, not entering the facilities or buildings at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. He purposefully did this to maintain his status being a member of the press. He always wore a vest with large lettering on the back, press. He's not a member of the occupiers. Now, here's a final quote from Pete Santilli. I'm not armed, I'm armed with my mouth. Santilli said in one video cited by the FBI, quote from Santilli again, I'm armed with my live stream, I'm armed with a coalition of like-minded individuals who sit at home on YouTube and watch this. Here's the bottom line. Again, we're back to how does it get so bad? Because if we don't have any reporters that will report on what's actually happening, and we have a government, many aspects of a government that's completely out of control by the conduct of the order followers that are just doing what they're, quote, told with no consideration as to the morality or lack thereof, we are headed for certain disaster, and we're almost there. And if we don't stand up and help defend our members of the independent press that are trying to report what's really happening, we'll soon know nothing about what's happening in the world. And we all know where that leads. So, again, that's one example of press being shut down. And how many cases are we now seeing of anybody who dares to film any police incident are now being threatened? That's not a democracy. Think about it. Now, again, I want to stress on the reporting as well, back to what's happening with the biosphere and the string of heat that's happening, that's being made worse by climate engineering, not better. A few records to consider, and I could go over these kinds of records all day long, but here's a few of the major ones. 15 of the last 16 hottest years ever recorded have happened since 2000. We've just passed. Think about this for all those who think that there's no global warming, the planet's cooling, and I don't know how you could think that truly, with aside from who says what, especially if you live in Northern California or other areas that are in meltdown. India's having the worst, perhaps the most deadly heat wave ever. The Barrier Reef, which I reported on before, looks like that die-off is actually worse than I reported. It looks like perhaps as much as 90% of the reef has now been bleached. The oceans are bathwater. Fish are dying everywhere. Heat temperature records are being set everywhere. We've just passed the 30th consecutive year of above average global temperatures, and 15 of the 16 hottest years since 2000. So consider this. If you're 30 years old or younger, you have never experienced a month in which the average surface temperature of the Earth was below average. 30-year-olds have never experienced this. So with our monthly heat record of 11 months in a row, shattering record after record after record after record. We are in what appears to be a runaway event right now. The worse that event gets, the more the military-industrial complex engineers our skies, sprays to block the sun. That's the express purpose of solar radiation management, to block the sun. And that's exactly what we see happening. But that traps more heat than it deflects, destroys the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle, and poisons virtually everything on the surface of the planet. If you don't believe it's going on, please investigate. That's all I ask. Now, in a general summary before we end the show here, for those who've chosen to believe that the military-industrial complex, industrialized civilization have not decimated the planet, please back up, clear your lens, and look at reality. We're on the 6th anniversary of the BP disaster, by the way. How well did that go? And back to journalists who tried to speak out about the BP disaster, maybe Pete Santilli is lucky, because about the BP disaster, Matt Simmons, the world's foremost independent expert on deep water drilling, was on CNN doing some reporting, and he reported what they didn't want him to report, that the well was not plugged fully, that the seafloor had heaved, and that oil was spewing from the seafloor. And guess what? Mr. Simmons died unexpectedly in his swimming pool the next day. A coincidence? I'll let you decide. Back to what the military-industrial complex is doing to the planet with disasters like BP and fracking. And for those who think fracking is okay, I'm not sure what reality you're living in, but it's not this one. And it doesn't take a lot of thought to figure out that pumping 500 toxic chemicals into the ground, contaminating groundwater forever, is not a good thing to do. Now, that's quite simple. So for those who are more interested in cheap gas than they are a planet that supports life, think about that. Please think about that. And again, in regard to the environment, I fully understand that the majority don't want to hear the truth. They want someone to lie to them. They want someone to tell them everything's fine, that anyone who says otherwise is just an alarmist and is spending too much time on the internet instead of watching Fox News and CNN, apparently, where they get their information. Consider this: if you live in Shasta County and you like fracking or deep sea oil drilling, would you like an oil well in the middle of Lake Shasta? How well would that go over? Think about it. Now, again, all those that are in total denial about what's happening around the planet right now, you won't be there long. Events are unfolding now that can't be hidden for much longer. As I stated so many times, we're living under toxic skies. It's affecting our health, period. Whether you believe it or not, it's irrelevant. So, how do we deal with this? We need activists, not observers. We need activists to be active, period. Each of us should daily take the time to consider why we're here and what matters and what doesn't. We must set our priorities. If you're marching along with ideology and preconception, you're on the wrong track, period. A compass heading has to be reset constantly, or you won't end up where you wanted to be. And right now is the most precarious of times, because so much is happening so fast, and so few have their eye to the horizon. So few. Become one of the ones who does. It doesn't take that big a percentage of the population to change course, but that percentage must be dedicated to the common good. And eventually the rest will wake up. Another quote from Mr. Twain that's always in my mind. He said, "In the beginning of change, the patriot is brave and scarce, hated and scorned. But in the end, when his cause succeeds, the timid join him, for then it costs nothing to be a patriot." Lots of wisdom out there if we simply looked for it. Lots of nuggets. And if you feel inclined to just sit the bench because you believe you're powerless, don't. Don't believe that programming. You're not powerless. Remember, you're only responsible for you and what you do or don't do. The correct use of your own free will, that's your responsibility. All of us are necessary in this battle that we face. All of us are needed. Help us to expose the collective insanity. Help us to turn directions. Make your voice heard. This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org. Until next week, thank you.